Hello, welcome to episode 120 of the Inside Knowledge podcast for people with IBS. I'm Anna Mapson. Today I'm talking about FODMAP reintroduction. This is a stage of the low FODMAP diet that people get pretty stuck on, and it can be a little bit troublesome. So we're going to talk about how to do the introductions, a little bit about why it's difficult and like some of the challenges you might be facing or some of the reasons you've put off reintroducing foods, and also how to measure the information that you're getting. And when you are trying to reintroduce foods, what should you be looking for? People are told to go on the low FODMAP diet either by reading a blog post or perhaps information from your doctor who's diagnosed you with IBS and then told you about what to eat, given you a handout for the low FODMAP diet, and then off you go. And there's very little support for the most important part of the process, which is actually how do you test these foods? Because the low FODMAP diet, what we're doing is removing the most highly fermentable carbohydrates for a set amount of time and then slowly reintroducing them in order to find whether you have a food trigger for your symptoms. That's the whole purpose of the diet. It's not just to try and manage symptoms, it's to try and see if there is a particular reason in what you're eating for how you're feeling. The reasons FODMAPs upset your gut is they can either be fermented by gut bacteria in the large intestine, or they can draw water into the small and large intestine, creating bloating and maybe gas, bubbling. So they can really add to those typical IBS type symptoms, including things like cramping, pain, hypersensitivity. Those can be triggered by high FODMAP meals. The restriction phase is you just cut out the highest FODMAP foods for 2 to 6 weeks. Then you go through this reintroduction process, and that's what I want to tell you a bit about today. The purpose of the reintroduction phase, as I said, was to try and identify if particular FODMAPs are your issue. But you can only really do that if you feel a bit better after going on the restrictive phase. So if you felt better when you cut them out, it could be that you have a reaction to certain foods, such as high quantities of dairy or maybe stone fruits like apricots, peaches, and cherries. Maybe these are your triggers. But the other reasons for feeling better whilst you are on a low FODMAP diet can also be non-food related. So sometimes when we focus on something, it improves just through focusing on it. Maybe you've changed your diet, changed things up a bit, and actually you're adding in different types of fiber, or you're no longer having the biscuits that you always do at the office because you feel like they don't fit with the FODMAP diet. There can be lots of other reasons why we're making changes that we feel better. And it's not only just about the FODMAPs. There's actually this effect in research called the Hawthorne effect. And that is when you start to measure something, it can improve just because people are aware that it's being measured. And so you pay more attention. Maybe you start to do it more carefully, and therefore you start to feel better. So sometimes just by giving something our attention, it can actually help us to create a change that we actually want to see. Completing the low FODMAP reintroduction process can take quite a long time, and that is because you need to allow each reintroduction challenge around 4 or 5 days. So the process that we're going to go through is you pick a FODMAP group, for example, fructose, and you're going to pick a food from within that group, start with a small amount on day 1, then a larger amount day 2, a little bit more on day 3, and then a rest day on day 4, which is when you go back to the low FODMAP diet and you just have a break before you start the next one. With a FODMAP group such as mannitol, which includes the foods mushrooms and celery, you would pick something, say mushrooms, and you need to find out how much a small low FODMAP portion is. Now, with mushrooms, they are so high in the FODMAP mannitol that actually even half a mushroom will go into a high FODMAP amount. So you're just starting with a tiny amount. On the Monash University app, which is just called FODMAP, there is the introduction guidelines, and this all is laid out for you, which is really, really helpful. It's about £7 to download the app, and then you've got it and you can refer back to it. This is the kind of thing I walk my clients through, though, so that we can do it really carefully and work out what's the best approach, like what order to do it in, all of these things. Now, the reason you need to know what is a low FODMAP and what is a high FODMAP amount is you may assume, okay, mushrooms, they're pretty small, don't need much. A portion of vegetables is normally around 80 grams. So I'm just going to go for, say, 70 grams and just start just under the portion and then work up. Okay, that doesn't really work because you're already going to be starting on what is, in a FODMAP terms, considered a big portion. Although if you look at it on your plate, it wouldn't look like too much. The reason we need to know is because we want to start off at a moderate FODMAP portion, really. And the purpose of that is to help you not go overboard on the first trial. The reason for taking it really slow and doing the FODMAP reintroductions carefully is partly about getting confidence back in the foods. I said on episode 119, which you can go back and listen to, that it's unlikely that all the FODMAPs are your trigger. So we want to make sure that we're building up confidence with each FODMAP group individually. And we need to know which foods are in which group as well is also really key. Another consideration when you're choosing foods for the FODMAP reintroduction is you need to know whether a food has more than one FODMAP in it. For example, chickpeas is considered to be high for galacto-oligosaccharides, that's GOS, and fructans. So this spans 2 FODMAP categories. The same for apples. This spans the category of fructose and also sorbitol. So if you're testing something like that, which goes across 2 groups, I suggest that you start with each of the groups individually first, and then come to the categories that go across more than one FODMAP group. With the example of apples, I always suggest you test a food from the fructose group first, because there is a lot of foods in this category. Then you're going to choose something from the sorbitol category. And if you pass both of those challenges well and you have no reactions, then what you might do is test apples. Because if you jump straight to apples, then you're not going to know if you have a reaction, whether it was the fructose, whether it was the sorbitol, or whether it was something else. So that's something I meant to say at the beginning, is that there are lots of other compounds in foods which are nothing to do with FODMAPs that can also trigger reactions. So let's think about what happens when you have a reaction to a certain food and what you might do about it. If you're someone who's followed a low FODMAP diet for months or maybe even years, then you could be at the stage where you are still having few symptoms, but you don't really know which FODMAPs are your problem. You haven't got a good baseline. What we want to try and do is to get to as good a place as we can before we start the reintroductions. If you're doing the FODMAP diet for the first time and you are in the restrictive phase and you're following that very carefully and strictly for 2 to 6 weeks, then you can just move straight into the reintroduction phase at a point where you feel like you've made enough progress. So, for example, if your bloating was 9 out of 10 every day, and now it's like a 3 or 4 out of 10, some days it's worse than others, but generally you're seeing an improvement, that's okay. That's a good baseline to start from to test out whether cauliflower is your problem or whether lentils are your issue. Right, we want to make sure we've seen some kind of improvement. If you haven't seen any improvement by taking out these foods and you're still getting bloating that was as bad as it was 2 weeks ago, 4 weeks ago, despite removing all the FODMAPs, then it's clearly not FODMAPs that are your problem, and you can just scrap the diet. Like, it obviously hasn't worked for you. And remember that 1 in 4 people will not get any progress at all with their symptoms when they're following this diet. So it's really not for everyone. Don't feel bad. There are other things you can do. There are other investigations, other tests, or maybe other food trials as well. One thing people ask me all the time is, what order should they do the FODMAP reintroductions? And it really doesn't matter. Honestly, it doesn't matter. The considerations that I go through with people are, what would make the biggest difference to your cooking? And normally they say onions or garlic or wheat or dairy. If you really, really miss red peppers, say, for example, and you haven't been able to eat much of them and you use them a lot in your cooking, then let's start there with fructose foods, which is what red peppers are high in. And let's go from there. It doesn't matter as long as it's something that's going to help you. The challenges which open the biggest doors are normally the fructan containing vegetables, which is all things like the cruciferous veg, and grapefruit and leeks are all in that category. A large quantity of banana. Those might be helpful for you. Fructose is good, another one, because it has red pepper, tomatoes, broad beans, asparagus. There's a few things in there which might not sound fructosey, as in fruity, but really there's a lot of foods in there, so that can be helpful. But for other people, they really miss apples, say. So then we're going to go for fructose, then sorbitol, then do the apples. It really doesn't matter. It's whatever will help you the most. That is the order that you do them in. First of all, you get to a semi-good baseline. You don't have to be perfect, but you do have to have some improvement, as I was just saying. Then when you feel you've got to some sort of improvement that you can test against, then you start the first challenge. You go through the 3 days. Now, what would you look for? How would you know whether you're having a reaction? Well, firstly, you want to track your individual symptoms. So for you, it could be pain, it could be reflux, reoccurrence, it could be headaches, it could be something slightly unrelated, like a flare-up of your eczema or something. But thinking mostly about the digestion, we're also thinking about bloating, bowel habits, like does it create more frequent bowel movements for you? Is that a good thing? Is that what you want, or do you want less? So you will have to track your individual symptoms, but what I suggest is thinking about the food when you eat it. How do you feel straight after eating it? Then you might think about, say you had something for lunch, like how do you feel by the end of the day? Can you notice in your digestion that you ate some red pepper at lunchtime? Did it make a difference to your afternoon? And then the next morning as well, how does it feel the next day? Do you have any more significant gas, any pain? How are you feeling? So you'll have to think about what your symptoms are, what you want to track, and then keep a note of it, like maybe a few hours after eating, 12 hours after eating, and then the next day. So the reason for doing it 3 days in a row is that we want that food to be in your system consistently and seeing how you're going to react to it over a number of days. Now, for some people I work with who are really sensitive and they need to do things in a much more cautious way, you could even go to every other day. That doesn't give you such good results, I don't think, but if it allows you to do the test in the first place, that's a good place to start. If you have an immediate flare-up of your symptoms, for example, you're trying bread and you have half a slice of bread and suddenly you're getting gassy, you're in a lot of pain, you're feeling awful, you don't have to progress on to day 2 and day 3. That should be obvious, but no one's forcing you to do this. You don't have to eat these foods. It's a test, okay? A trial. If you get to day 2 and you're okay, and then it's only on day 3 you get the symptoms, that is also good data. It's good information that's going to help you progress to the third stage of the FODMAP diet, which is when you have your own personalised diet. So, for example, say you can manage 1 slice of bread, but when you go to 2 slices of bread, then you're starting to get symptoms. The data that you've understood from that is, firstly, wheat is not a huge problem for you and you can handle small portions. But if you were to eat a sandwich every single day, you may end up with more bloating or more gas or more pain, whatever it is. So each food that you test will give you slightly different information. If you are testing the fructose category, for example, with mango, and then you have a big reaction to that, What I would suggest is you then put fructose to the back of the queue and come back to it in a couple of weeks, and we'll test it with another food from that group. You don't have to test mango again, but you could test another food that is high in fructose, because it might be something else in the mango that you reacted to rather than just the fructose. The other challenge with the reintroductions that some people get confused upon is, once you've passed a challenge, if it was okay, do you then need to remove it again while you test the other FODMAPs? So there is mixed advice on this. I tend to encourage my clients to keep the foods in if they've passed the test. So if you could eat garlic and you were okay with it, you had no reactions, then I think you should include it in your diet whilst you are testing the others. That said, maybe you don't want to have tons of garlic bread in the same meal when you're testing, lactose or something, because that is potentially, a lot of garlic in one go, maybe more than you would normally eat. Now, I mentioned that FODMAP app before, and it is very good in terms of laying out for you which FODMAP groups you need to test, what foods you could select, and at what levels. So it's very good in that way. But my one hesitation with using it is that the portion sizing is really small. So for onions, they say that you should only go up to about 2 tablespoons of onions. If you have a curry in, like a takeaway curry, there's so many onions in there. And I feel like you need to get to the stage where you've really tested a normal portion of what you would eat. When I cook and I make my own food, I often put in 2 cloves of garlic between 4 of us. That's quite a lot for some people. I really like it quite garlicky, but if I was only testing, half a teaspoon of garlic, it might not be enough to test out what I am eating in a normal meal. So that is a consideration that you need to make around what is your normal diet? What is it you're going back to? The other thing is, if you have a certain food which you really hate, do you have to test it? That is another question. Typically, people don't want to drink cow's milk to test lactose. The reason I do suggest drinking cow's milk is because it's not fermented like cheese or yogurt. It's also not high fat, such as cheese. So it's going to give you more of a clear representation of your reaction to lactose than another dairy-containing food. We're always trying to isolate the FODMAP element, not the other things in the food that could be causing a problem. If you've passed the lactose challenge, for example, though, and you can drink a whole glass of cow's milk with no immediate issues, no terrible issues the next morning, then you're all right with lactose. Then the next stage is for you to then test, can you handle fermented dairy or yogurt, say kefir? This is different to milk, and it may affect your digestion in a different way. If it does, it's not the lactose that is doing that, and that's still really key information. As I mentioned, if you've done one challenge and you've kind of opened the door to everything else in that category, so say you tested for mango, you were fine with it, that means you can try cherry tomatoes. It means you can try red pepper, and you don't need to test each one of those in the same way. So that's another question, is like, do I have to test every single fruit and veg in this very slow way? No. This is the point of doing the categories, understanding which foods are in which FODMAP group, and then being able to kind of open the door. You've tested high fructose, it wasn't a problem. Therefore, all other foods which are also high in fructose are not a problem in terms of FODMAPs. But they might have other things in them, as I mentioned. It's not clear cut. And our bodies are not machines. We cannot always replicate the exact amounts that the FODMAP categorization has done. So it doesn't always work in the same way. So I guess I just wanted to wrap that bit up by saying each challenge, you can personalize it. So you can start with an even smaller amount than the FODMAP app suggests. If they suggest starting with 1 tablespoon of onion, you could start half a teaspoon if you want. It doesn't matter. The purpose is that it's fitting you, your symptoms, your nervousness about the food, that's really important. So if it helps you to get to the point where you can put onion in your mouth, I think starting with a small amount is better. If you get to the stage where you've done the full challenge and you got to 2 tablespoons of onion, but normally you have a curry every Friday night and it is swimming in loads of cooked onion, then you need to ramp it up and go to a bigger portion, because that is what is your real life. That is part of the key element to the FODMAP diet reintroduction process. It is about finding data. It's about finding information that is going to help you personalize this diet and understand your particular triggers. If you were fine with onions, garlic, everything else except dairy, that seems to be your main problem, then you can just stay avoiding dairy. But say, for example, you found that lactose was a big issue, even on the first day when you had a small amount of milk in one glass and you just got an instant reaction to it. I would still then, like I said, put that food to the back of the queue and come back to it in a few weeks. And the reason we want to do that is because there may have been other confounding factors that interrupted your test on that week. It could have been the point in the menstrual cycle that you were at. Maybe you were very tired and you didn't sleep well that week. Maybe you were feeling a bit stressed because you had a sort of altercation with your friend. Whatever it was, there could have been other things that interrupted your digestion process. And we don't want to then rule out a whole FODMAP group on the basis of one trial. So you have 2 options, is either to repeat the same trial with the same food from the same FODMAP group in 2 weeks, 2 months, whenever, or you choose another food from that group. So when I picked mushrooms earlier, actually next time pick celery. Although I actually really hate raw celery and I would never be eating 3 stalks of celery, which is the test for day 3, because I just hate it raw. But I love mushrooms, so I would be doing it with those. All right, so you, again, personalizing it, picking the food that suits you and trying to adapt it to your culture, your way of eating, because that is what you're going to be left with. You want to try and expand it to get to the most normal kind of diet that you can. Okay, I feel like it was maybe a little bit rambly today, but I just had so much to say. As I was talking, I kept thinking of more and more things that I wanted to fit into this episode. However, this element of FODMAP restriction and reintroduction is so challenging for many, many people with IBS and SIBO. So it can be a big problem, which is why I wanted to focus on FODMAPs. Next week, I'm going to be talking about why the FODMAP diet might not have worked for you. And we'll go through some of the reasons why it doesn't work, which might be helpful. So I'll leave it there for this week. Thanks so much for listening to this episode of the Inside Knowledge podcast. Better digestion for everyone.